Hello, Midnight Wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvane. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. There are moments in life that stay with you forever, not because you understand them, but because you never do. Most memories fade over time. Faces become blurry. Conversations disappear. Entire years can blend together until only a few important moments remain. But every now and then something happens that burns itself into your memory so deeply that decades later you can still recall every detail. This is one of those memories for me. I was somewhere between 16 and 18 years old at the time. Old enough to drive, old enough to stay out late with friends, but still very much a kid in a lot of ways. Like most teenagers, my friends and I loved going to midnight movie showings. There was something exciting about being out so late when most of the world was asleep. That particular night seemed completely ordinary. A group of us had gone to see a movie at a local theater. I don't even remember what film we watched anymore. The movie itself has long since disappeared from my memory. What happened afterward is what I remember. The showing ended sometime after midnight. When we stepped outside, the parking lot was mostly empty. The air had that strange feeling late-night places often have. Everything was quiet. The crowds were gone. Most businesses nearby were closed. The bright lights of the theater stood out against the darkness surrounding it. My friends and I were talking about the movie as we headed toward the parking lot. Then I noticed them. A man and two young women were walking toward the theater entrance. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The man looked completely ordinary. If I tried to describe him now, I couldn't tell you anything remarkable about his appearance. He wasn't dressed strangely. He wasn't acting aggressively. He wasn't carrying anything suspicious. He looked normal. And yet the moment I saw him, something happened. A feeling hit me unlike anything I had experienced before or since. I've tried for years to find the right words to describe it. Fear isn't the right word. Anxiety isn't the right word either. It was something deeper, more instinctive. The moment I looked at him, every alarm bell in my body started screaming. It felt like pure danger, not uncertainty, not suspicion. Danger, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. One second I was casually walking with my friends. The next second I felt as though every survival instinct I possessed had suddenly activated. My stomach dropped. The hair on my arms stood up. My chest tightened. It was the strongest feeling of dread I have ever experienced. The strangest part was that I had absolutely no reason to feel that way. The man wasn't doing anything threatening. He wasn't looking at us. He wasn't approaching us. He was simply walking toward the theater with the two girls. Yet something inside me was screaming to get away. Looking back, I can still remember how confusing that feeling was. Part of me knew it didn't make sense. Part of me knew I was reacting to someone who appeared completely normal. But the feeling was so powerful that I couldn't ignore it. I turned to my friends and said something that probably sounded strange. I suggested we go back inside the theater for a little while. I don't remember exactly how I phrased it. Maybe I mentioned needing the restroom. Maybe I said I forgot something. Whatever the reason, they agreed. We turned around and headed back inside. At the time, I didn't explain what I was feeling. How could I? Imagine telling your friends that a random stranger in a parking lot made you feel terrified for no reason. It would sound ridiculous, so I kept most of it to myself. But I couldn't stop watching him. Even after we went back inside, I kept looking through the windows whenever I could. My attention never left that man. I remember feeling almost obsessed with keeping track of where he was. It wasn't curiosity, it was vigilance. The same feeling you get when you know something is wrong, but don't know what. The man and the two girls continued toward the theater entrance. Then something unusual happened. They stopped. For no obvious reason, they paused before reaching the building. The man paced around briefly, back and forth. Not for very long, just enough to catch my attention. Then, without entering the theater, all three of them turned around. They walked back toward their vehicle. A few moments later, they got into the car and drove away. I remember feeling relief almost immediately. The moment they left, the overwhelming feeling of dread began to fade. Not completely, but enough that I could breathe normally again. Eventually, my friends and I left as well. The rest of the night was uneventful. Life moved on. At first, I treated the entire experience as one of those strange moments that occasionally happen. Maybe I had misread something. Maybe my instincts had overreacted. Maybe I was tired after staying up late. The experience stayed in the back of my mind, but I didn't obsess over it. Then, 2 weeks later, everything changed. The news spread quickly. 2 teenagers had been shot and killed outside that same movie theater. The details shocked everyone. The victims were simply leaving the theater when it happened. There was no obvious robbery, no apparent argument, no clear motive, just a senseless act of violence. As I listened to the reports, a terrible feeling settled into my stomach. My mind immediately went back to that night, back to the parking lot, back to the man and the 2 girls, back to the overwhelming sense of danger that had washed over me. The more details I heard, the harder it became to ignore the connection my brain was making. A man, 2 girls, the same theater, a late-night encounter. Again and again, my thoughts returned to those 3 people. To this day, I cannot prove they were the same individuals. I have no evidence, no photographs, no names, no police reports connecting them. Nothing. All I have is a feeling, a memory, and a coincidence that has never stopped bothering me. Logically, I understand that countless people visit movie theaters every week. It's entirely possible that the people I saw had nothing to do with the crime. It's possible they were completely innocent. It's possible my brain connected unrelated events afterward because of the tragedy. I recognize all of that. But another part of me still remembers how I felt. That feeling wasn't normal. It wasn't mild discomfort. It wasn't social anxiety. It wasn't nervousness. It was pure, overwhelming certainty that something was wrong. The kind of certainty that arrives before your conscious mind understands why. Many people describe experiences like that as intuition. Others call it instinct. Some believe the human brain notices subtle details that never reach conscious awareness. Tiny clues in body language, facial expressions, movement, or behavior that trigger warning signals without us understanding why. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe I unconsciously noticed something dangerous about that man. Maybe some part of my brain processed information that my conscious mind couldn't explain. Or maybe it was simply a coincidence. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that I've never experienced anything else quite like it. I felt uncomfortable around people before. I've encountered rude people, angry people, suspicious people. This was different. This felt primal, ancient, the kind of fear that exists purely to keep you alive. The most unsettling part is how strongly it affected my behavior. Without understanding why, I convinced my friends to change our plans. Without understanding why, I couldn't stop watching that man. Without understanding why, I felt relief when he left. And then, 2 weeks later, tragedy struck in the exact same location. Even now, years later, I occasionally think about that night. I wonder who those people were. I wonder whether my memory is connecting events that were never actually related. I wonder whether the man I saw was simply an ordinary person who happened to cross paths with me at the wrong moment. Most of all, I wonder what would have happened if my friends and I had continued walking through the parking lot instead of turning around and going back inside. Maybe nothing would have happened. Maybe the entire experience was meaningless. Maybe it was all coincidence. But every time I revisit that memory, I find myself returning to the same conclusion. I have never felt fear like that before, and I have never felt it since. Whatever caused it, that feeling may have been the most powerful warning my instincts have ever given me. Whether it saved us from anything or not, I'll never know. But more than a decade later, I can still see that man walking toward the theater, and I can still feel every alarm in my body screaming that something wasn't right. I've had a few experiences over the years that I still can't fully explain, but almost all of them happened in the same place. It's an old historic hotel in San Antonio that's well known for its beautiful architecture, rich history, and, according to many visitors, paranormal activity. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it's the kind of place that has hundreds of stories attached to it. My family has stayed there several times throughout my life. Some people would probably avoid going back after experiencing strange things, but we kept returning. Part of it was because we genuinely loved the hotel. It was absolutely beautiful, with incredible Victorian architecture, antique furniture, long winding hallways, and a feeling that you had stepped back in time the moment you walked through the front doors. The other reason was harder to explain. From our very first visit, both my mom and I felt an unusual connection to the place. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even excitement. It was something much stranger. The building somehow felt familiar. Even though we'd never been there before, we both had this overwhelming feeling that we already knew it. That feeling stayed with us every time we visited. The hotel itself is unlike most modern buildings. The hallways twist and turn in unexpected directions, and there are little staircases and small level changes scattered throughout the floors. Sometimes you're walking down what seems like a straight hallway, and suddenly there are 2 or 3 small steps leading either up or down before the hallway continues. It's almost maze-like. The first time we stayed there, I expected to get completely lost. Strangely, neither my mom nor I ever did. Even without maps or signs, we somehow always seemed to know where we were going. It was almost instinctive. We'd make random turns, walk through unfamiliar hallways, and somehow arrive exactly where we wanted to be. Neither of us could explain why it felt so natural. Later, we learned that in the early 1900s, it wasn't just a hotel. Many people actually lived there for extended periods of time. Knowing that somehow made the strange feeling of familiarity even harder to ignore. The first unusual experience didn't even happen to me. A few years before my own strange encounter, I was staying there with a friend. We were walking through one of those long hallways with the small sets of steps built into the floor. Out of nowhere, my friend suddenly stumbled forward. When I asked what happened, she looked completely confused. She told me that someone had pushed her, not hard enough to make her fall, but definitely enough to throw her off balance. The strange part was that nobody was standing behind us. We looked in every direction. The hallway was empty. At the time, we laughed it off. Maybe she'd simply lost her footing on the little steps. Still, she insisted that it had genuinely felt like a hand pushing against her back. Years later, something happened to me that was much harder to dismiss. One night, I was asleep in my hotel room. I'd been sleeping peacefully for hours. Then, completely out of nowhere, I woke up instantly. Not because of a loud noise, not because of a bad dream. I woke up because I felt someone slap my thigh. It wasn't a light touch. It wasn't the feeling of blankets shifting or my own muscles twitching. It was a firm, unmistakable slap. The kind where the hand lands flat against your leg before the fingers naturally close slightly at the end, almost like someone beginning to grab you. The sensation was incredibly specific, so specific that I sat straight up in bed before I was even fully awake. For a few seconds, I couldn't understand what had happened. I looked around the room. There was nobody there. The room was completely quiet. Nothing had fallen. Nothing was out of place. I was alone. I tried convincing myself that maybe I dreamed it, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt exactly like another person had physically touched me. Even now, I can still remember exactly how it felt. Oddly enough, despite how startling it was, I never felt threatened. Confused? Absolutely, but not afraid. Another experience happened while I was simply exploring the hotel. One of my favorite parts of the building was the Victorian-style lobby. The furniture, decorations, stained glass, and antique details were incredible. I spent a lot of time slowly walking around, looking at everything. One afternoon, I was completely distracted by the architecture. I was looking up at the ceilings and admiring all the details instead of paying attention to where I was walking. As I turned around quickly, I suddenly walked directly into someone. Or at least, that's exactly what it felt like. The impact was solid enough that I immediately apologized. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." The words came out automatically. Then I looked up. There wasn't anyone there. Not just that. There wasn't anyone nearby at all. I turned in every direction. The lobby around me was empty. For a second, I honestly questioned myself. Had I somehow imagined the impact? Had I lost my balance? It didn't feel like either of those things. It genuinely felt as though I had bumped directly into another person. Yet there was nobody standing in front of me. That moment stayed with me for the rest of the trip. It wasn't frightening. It was simply impossible to explain. Another time, I was walking through one of the upper hallways. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed someone walking ahead of me. I didn't think much about it. Hotels are full of guests. The figure calmly continued down the hallway before turning into one of the rooms. Only, they never opened the door. They simply disappeared into it. Not through an open doorway. Not after unlocking it. The figure reached the door and seemed to pass directly through it before vanishing completely. I stopped walking. I stared at the door for several seconds. Nothing happened afterward. Nobody came back out. No sound came from inside the room. The hallway remained completely quiet. Like the other experiences, I couldn't explain what I'd seen. What makes all of these memories so unusual is that none of them ever felt threatening. People often assume that strange experiences automatically come with fear. For me, that wasn't true. Even after being touched while sleeping, even after feeling like I bumped into someone who wasn't there, even after seeing a figure disappear through a closed door, I never had the feeling that I was in danger. Instead, the atmosphere always felt strangely peaceful. Almost as though whatever history remained inside that old building simply existed alongside the people visiting it. Maybe there are perfectly logical explanations for everything that happened. Old hotels create unusual lighting. Long hallways can play tricks on your eyes. Sleep can blur the line between dreams and reality. Our brains sometimes fill in details that aren't really there. I understand all of that. In fact, those explanations are probably the most likely ones. Still, every strange experience I had happened in that same building over several different visits spanning years. Each one was different. Each one left me questioning what I'd experienced. And yet, none of them ever made me afraid to return. If anything, they made the hotel even more fascinating. It's a place filled with history, and history has a way of leaving an impression on people. Whether that impression comes from imagination, coincidence, or something that can't yet be explained, I honestly don't know. All I know is that every time I walked those maze-like hallways, I felt as though I'd been there before. Every turn seemed familiar. Every staircase felt expected. And despite everything that happened there, I always left with the same feeling. Not fear, just curiosity. Even today, if someone asked whether I would stay there again, my answer would be yes without hesitation. It's still one of the most beautiful historic hotels I've ever visited. The strange experiences have never overshadowed that. They've simply become part of the memories that make the place unforgettable. When people hear the phrase police brutality, most of them think about videos they've seen online or stories that made national headlines. I used to think that too, until I worked as an EMT in a city that was already known for problems involving excessive use of force by police officers. What shocked me the most wasn't that these incidents happened. It was how often they happened without anyone outside the neighborhood ever hearing about them. The stories that make the news are only a small fraction of what actually happens. Day after day, I watched situations that never should have become violent turn into unnecessary confrontations. I saw officers escalate encounters that could have been handled calmly. Many of the calls we responded to involved people who had already been injured before we even arrived. Instead of treating injuries caused by accidents or medical emergencies, we were often treating people who had been hurt during interactions that didn't appear to require that level of force. One of the hardest parts was feeling completely powerless. People always say that if someone is being assaulted, you should call the police. But what are you supposed to do when the people hurting someone are the very officers who would respond to that call? There isn't an easy answer to that question, and it's something I struggled with throughout my time working there. Some of the incidents I witnessed still stay with me. I remember seeing situations where force seemed completely unnecessary, yet it was used anyway. Families would stand nearby, crying and begging officers to stop while their loved one was being restrained or struck. The fear on their faces was impossible to ignore. If anyone tried to get too close or intervene, the officers would immediately create more distance, sometimes by drawing or threatening to use their weapons. That usually caused everyone to step back, even if they believed what was happening was wrong. Watching those moments was disturbing. Thinking about what it must have felt like to be the person on the receiving end was even worse. One incident that has never left my mind involved a young child. Watching someone so young caught in that kind of situation was heartbreaking. Their family pleaded with the officers to stop, but they felt helpless. No matter how loudly they begged or how desperate they became, there was very little they could do without risking the situation becoming even more dangerous. As an EMT, my responsibility was to provide medical care. I couldn't simply ignore what I witnessed, though. Whenever I believed something needed to be documented, I made detailed reports. I filed complaints through the proper channels whenever I could. I carefully recorded dates, times, injuries, and everything I personally observed, hoping that if a case ever reached a courtroom, there would at least be an accurate medical record available. I truly believe those reports might make a difference. Unfortunately, they almost never did. Again and again, nothing happened. The complaints disappeared into the system. The reports went nowhere. The investigations, if they happened at all, rarely resulted in meaningful action. Over time, it became incredibly frustrating to watch the same patterns repeat themselves. One of the biggest problems is that so much of the available evidence is controlled by the very people involved in the incident. Official reports, statements, and recordings don't always tell the complete story. When there are conflicting accounts, it can become extremely difficult for victims to prove what actually happened. That's one of the reasons I strongly support bystanders recording public interactions whenever it's legal and safe to do so. As a healthcare worker, I had legal and ethical responsibilities regarding patient privacy. There were strict limits on what I could share publicly, even when I wanted the truth to be known. Those privacy laws exist for good reasons. But they also meant there were many situations where I couldn't simply release information to the public. An independent video recorded by someone nearby doesn't have those same limitations. It can capture events exactly as they unfold. If the original file keeps its metadata, it can also help show when and where the recording was made, making it much harder for people to dismiss it as manipulated or generated by artificial intelligence. In many cases, recordings from witnesses have been the only reason certain incidents ever became public knowledge. Without them, some stories might never have reached the news at all. The people involved could have remained completely unknown outside their own families and communities. After leaving that city, I noticed something else. Whenever I talked about my experiences, people's reactions often depended on their own backgrounds. Many of my white friends, especially those who had never lived in that area, struggled to believe what I described. Some thought I was exaggerating or focusing only on the worst examples. Others assumed I was letting a few isolated incidents shape my opinion of an entire system. That wasn't my experience. The frequency was what affected me most. On the other hand, nearly all of my Black and Hispanic friends who had lived in that same community immediately understood what I was talking about. I rarely had to explain much. Many of them had either experienced similar situations themselves or knew family members, friends, or neighbors who had. Those conversations reminded me that two people can live in the same city and have completely different experiences with public institutions. I don't claim to have all the answers, and I know that not every officer behaves the same way. During my career, I also worked alongside officers who treated people with professionalism, respect, and compassion, even under difficult circumstances. Those individuals absolutely exist, and they deserve to be recognized as well. But ignoring the harmful incidents I witnessed would be dishonest. Working as an EMT gave me a perspective that I never expected to have. It showed me how important accountability, transparency, and independent evidence can be when serious questions arise about the use of force. Looking back, one of the biggest lessons I learned is that documentation matters. Careful medical records matter. Honest witnesses matter. And when people safely and legally record public interactions, those recordings can become some of the most important evidence available. Because sometimes, the truth never reaches the public, unless someone was there to document it, and too many stories disappear long before anyone outside the community ever has a chance to hear them. I own a large valley in western Norway, covering about 1,000 acres. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been, with mountains surrounding a quiet lake, thick forests stretching up the hillsides, and almost no signs of modern life. Most people would probably look at it and think it was peaceful, and during the day it usually is. But the valley also has a dark history. Long before I owned the land, 2 major accidents happened there during the early and middle part of the 1900s. Together, those tragedies claimed the lives of 135 people. The details of those events are still remembered by people in the area, and anyone who knows the history understands that the valley has seen more than its share of loss. Whether that history has anything to do with what I've experienced, I honestly don't know. I've spent a lot of time there over the years. I've hunted, hiked, fished, and stayed alone in my cabin for days at a time. Being out there has always given me a sense of peace, but I've also witnessed several things that I still can't explain. Some of them were easy to dismiss, Others have stayed with me ever since. The strangest experience happened in 2018. It was a calm day, and I was near the lake not far from my cabin. The weather was good, and the surface of the water was almost completely still. There wasn't much wind, so the lake looked like glass, reflecting the mountains and the trees surrounding it. As I looked across the water, something immediately caught my attention. About 100 meters from the shoreline, I noticed what looked like a child floating on a wooden plank. At first, I didn't think anything unusual about it. My immediate reaction was concern. The child seemed to be sitting or lying on a piece of wood drifting on the lake, and the distance from shore made me worry that something was wrong. I called out as loudly as I could. There was no response. I shouted again. Still nothing. The child didn't wave, didn't move, didn't even look in my direction. For a moment, I wondered if they simply couldn't hear me. I always carry binoculars with me when I'm out there, especially while hunting or watching wildlife, so I quickly picked them up to get a better look. When I looked through them, I could see the figure much more clearly. It was definitely a child. There was no doubt in my mind about that. The child appeared to be floating quietly on the plank, completely motionless. I continued watching for another moment, trying to decide whether I needed to find a boat or run along the shoreline to get closer. Then, without any warning at all, the child disappeared. There wasn't a splash. There wasn't any movement. The plank didn't tip over. The figure didn't dive into the water. 1 second the child was there. The next second there was absolutely nothing. The lake was completely empty. I lowered the binoculars, thinking maybe I'd somehow lost sight of them. Then I looked again. Nothing. I scanned every part of the lake. Still nothing. It was as though the child had simply vanished into thin air. I stayed there for quite a while, hoping I'd find some ordinary explanation. Maybe the figure had drifted behind something. Maybe I'd mistaken an object for a person. But nothing I saw afterward explained what had happened. To this day, I still don't know what I witnessed. Thankfully, I've never seen that child again. And honestly, I hope I never do. As unsettling as that experience was, it wasn't the most frightening thing I've seen in the valley. That happened sometime later while I was out hunting. Hunting has always been one of the reasons I spend so much time there. Walking quietly through the forest, following old trails, and spending hours surrounded by nature has always helped me clear my mind. On this particular day, everything seemed completely normal. The forest was quiet. Not unusually quiet, just peaceful. I had been walking for some time when I noticed movement farther ahead among the trees. At first, I assumed it was a deer. Then I realized it was much taller. I stopped walking and focused on the movement. That's when I saw it. Even now, I struggle to describe exactly what I was looking at. The figure looked roughly human in shape. It was walking upright on 2 legs, but almost everything else about it seemed wrong. It was incredibly tall. If I had to estimate, I would say at least 7.5 feet tall. Its arms seemed unusually long, hanging much lower than a normal person's. Its skin appeared extremely pale, almost white against the darker background of the forest. It wasn't wearing clothing that I could recognize. At least, none that stood out from where I was standing. The figure was moving away from me, climbing higher toward the mountain. Fortunately, it never looked in my direction. As far as I could tell, it never realized I was there. I remained completely still, afraid that even the smallest movement might attract its attention. For several seconds, I simply watched. The speed at which it moved didn't seem normal. Despite its size, it covered the rough ground with surprising ease. It didn't stumble over rocks or fallen trees. It simply continued uphill at a pace that seemed much faster than I thought possible. I remember trying to convince myself that there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was another hunter. Maybe the distance made someone appear taller than they really were. Maybe unusual lighting between the trees distorted what I was seeing. But none of those explanations felt convincing in that moment. The proportions looked wrong. The movement looked wrong. Everything about the figure felt unfamiliar. One thought kept repeating in my head. Leave. I didn't wait to see where it was going. I didn't try to follow it. I slowly backed away at first, trying not to make noise. Then, once I felt I had enough distance between us, I turned and ran. I ran all the way back to my cabin without stopping. Once I was inside, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and stayed there for the rest of the night. I barely slept. Every little sound outside made me stop and listen. I kept wondering whether I'd hear footsteps or something moving around outside. Nothing ever happened. Morning finally came, and everything looked completely normal again. The forest was quiet. The mountains looked exactly as they always had. There wasn't any sign that anything unusual had happened the day before. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't go hunting again for nearly a month. That alone says a lot, because hunting had always been something I genuinely enjoyed. After that experience, every trip into the woods reminded me of what I'd seen. I've spent a long time thinking about both of those experiences. The child on the lake, the tall figure in the forest. I've tried to come up with ordinary explanations for each of them. Maybe the child was an optical illusion caused by reflections on the water. Maybe what I saw in the woods was another person whose appearance was distorted by distance, lighting, and my angle of view. Those explanations are certainly possible. In fact, I hope they're true. Because the alternatives are much harder to accept. The valley is an isolated place with a long history, and spending enough time alone in nature teaches you that there are moments you simply can't explain right away. Sometimes your eyes play tricks on you. Sometimes your mind fills in missing details, and sometimes you witness something that stays with you because no explanation feels completely satisfying. I don't claim to know what I saw. I don't tell people that it was definitely paranormal. I only know what I experienced. I saw what appeared to be a child floating quietly on a plank in the middle of the lake before disappearing without a trace. On another day, I saw a pale, unusually tall figure walking through the forest toward the mountain with long arms and a speed that didn't seem natural. I've never seen either of them again. Part of me is grateful for that. The valley is still one of my favorite places in the world. It's beautiful, peaceful, and filled with history. I still visit it regularly, and I still love spending time there. But every now and then, when I'm standing alone beside the lake or walking through the forest at dusk, I can't help remembering those two moments. And even after all these years, I still find myself glancing toward the trees just a little more often than I used to. For several years, I lived in a cabin that had a reputation long before I ever moved in. It was tucked away in a quiet area, surrounded by nature. And at first glance, it looked like the perfect place to live. It was peaceful, beautiful, and far enough from town that the nights were incredibly quiet. But there was also a history attached to the property. Before I ever lived there, 3 people had died there in separate accidents over the years. I didn't know every detail about what had happened, and honestly, I wasn't overly concerned. Old houses and cabins often have stories attached to them, and I didn't want to let local rumors affect the way I looked at the place. Still, after living there for a while, I began experiencing things that were difficult to explain. Some incidents were small enough that I could dismiss them. Others were much harder to ignore. The strangest thing about the cabin centered around one particular wall. It looked completely ordinary. There was nothing visually different about it. It wasn't cracked. It wasn't leaning. It didn't appear damaged in any way. If someone walked into the cabin for the first time, they would never guess there was anything unusual about it. But over time, everyone living there came to the same conclusion. That wall simply didn't seem to tolerate having anything attached to it. At first, I assumed it was just bad luck. Maybe the nails weren't secure enough. Maybe the wood behind the drywall wasn't strong. Maybe I had simply mounted things poorly. Then the strange events kept happening. One day, I installed a wooden wine glass holder on that wall. It seemed like the perfect place for it. The rack held several wine glasses hanging upside down. Everything was level. Everything felt secure. I checked it more than once before deciding the job was finished. Later that evening, I was sitting quietly in the cabin when I heard a soft sound. It wasn't loud enough to alarm me. It almost sounded like someone lightly tapping glass. I looked toward the wall. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I realized one of the wine glasses was moving. Very slowly. It wasn't falling. It wasn't vibrating. It was gently sliding outward. I watched as the glass slowly reached the edge of the rack. Then it tipped over and fell to the floor. I stared at it, completely confused. Before I could even process what had happened, another glass began moving, exactly the same way. Slowly, steadily, as though someone invisible had carefully pushed it. It reached the edge. Then it fell. One after another, each glass repeated the same movement, not all at once, not because the rack had broken. Each one moved individually. Each one slowly slid to the edge before dropping. I couldn't explain it. The holder itself hadn't come loose. It was still firmly attached to the wall. Only the glasses had moved. Watching them fall one at a time was far more unsettling than if everything had simply crashed to the floor together. Eventually, we removed the wine rack. After that experience, we decided to try something simpler. We hung a clock on the same wall. Again, everything seemed perfectly secure. For a while, nothing happened. Then one day, without warning, the clock came off the wall. But it didn't fall the way gravity says it should. Instead of dropping straight down, it first moved downward several inches. Then, somehow, it shifted sideways. It traveled roughly a foot horizontally before finally hitting the floor. That alone would have been strange enough. But it wasn't over. When it landed, it didn't bounce. It didn't simply stop. Instead, it landed only about an inch away from the wall and began spinning. Not wobbling. Spinning, almost like someone had spun a saucer across a table. It continued spinning much longer than seemed possible. Everyone watching simply stood there in silence. None of us had an explanation. As strange as those events were, the animals made everything feel even more unsettling. We had dogs living with us at the cabin. Normally, they wandered freely through every room of the house. Except near that wall. For reasons we never understood, they avoided it. They would happily walk everywhere else, but seemed reluctant to spend time near that particular section of the room. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then one day, I came home to something I'd never seen before. Both dogs were standing directly in front of the wall. They weren't playing. They weren't looking out a window. They were staring at the wall itself. Both of them were barking non-stop, not at each other, not at another animal, at the wall. They acted as though something was standing there. I checked every part of the room. Nothing, no insects, no mice, no strange noises, nothing visible at all. Eventually, the barking stopped, but the memory stayed with me. Years later, I moved away from the cabin. Life continued, and I eventually stopped thinking about many of the strange things that had happened there. Almost 10 years passed. Then, unexpectedly, I was invited back. Some friends of mine had moved into the cabin. They knew I'd lived there before and invited me to come see the place again. When I arrived, I noticed they looked slightly uncomfortable. Eventually, the conversation turned toward the house itself. Before I had a chance to mention anything about my own experiences, they started telling me theirs. Almost immediately, I realized they were describing the exact same things. The strange feeling around one particular wall. Objects refusing to stay there. Unusual things happening for no obvious reason. I hadn't told them any of my stories beforehand. They volunteered the information completely on their own. That was probably the most unsettling part of all. Knowing that people completely unrelated to me had experienced the same pattern made it much harder to dismiss everything as coincidence. While they owned the cabin, they decided to remodel part of it. As part of the renovation, they planned to remove that particular wall. They hired a contractor to do the work. According to them, the contractor began breaking into the wall with a sledgehammer. During the job, he suffered a serious shoulder injury. The damage was severe enough that he couldn't continue the project. Whether the injury had anything to do with the wall itself is impossible to say. Construction work is physically demanding, and injuries unfortunately happen. Still, after everything else we'd experienced, it felt like another strange chapter in the cabin's history. They eventually hired a second contractor. This time, things turned out differently. After looking over the project, he suggested simply leaving that wall alone instead of removing it. That's exactly what they did. The remodel itself turned out beautifully. The cabin looked better than ever. The only thing that remained untouched was that wall. Even today, according to my friends, nothing really stays there. Decorations never seem to last. Pets still avoid the area. Dogs don't like standing near it. Cats won't spend time there either. Whenever someone tries placing furniture or decorative items against it, something eventually happens that convinces them to move everything somewhere else. I honestly don't know what caused any of it. Maybe there are structural issues hidden inside the wall. Maybe subtle vibrations affect objects in ways we never noticed. Maybe the unusual layout of the cabin creates strange physical effects that only seem mysterious. Those explanations are certainly possible. In fact, I'd prefer one of them to be true. But after living there myself, after returning nearly a decade later, and after hearing another family independently describe many of the same experiences, without any prompting, I've never been able to completely dismiss the feeling that there was something unusual about that cabin. Not necessarily something evil. Not something that ever made me feel directly threatened. Just something different. Even now, whenever I think back on that place, I don't remember the beautiful scenery first. I remember one perfectly ordinary-looking wall, a wall where wine glasses slowly slid off their rack one at a time. A clock somehow moved sideways before hitting the floor. Dogs barked at empty space. And years later, people who had never heard my stories quietly described the very same things I'd experienced. I've never found an explanation that completely satisfies me. Maybe one exists. Maybe it doesn't. All I know is that after everything I saw in that cabin, there's one wall I'll never forget. I don't get to tell this story very often because most people either laugh or assume I imagined the whole thing. Honestly, I understand why. If someone else told me this exact story, I'd probably struggle to believe it too. But I remember it so clearly that even now, years later, it still gives me chills. I was around 10 years old when it happened. I was spending the day at my cousin's grandmother's house. It wasn't my grandmother, but I had been there a few times before, so the house wasn't completely unfamiliar. My cousin lived nearby, and that day it was just the two of us. her dad, who was my uncle, and her grandmother. The house had 2 stories, and most of the bedrooms were upstairs. My cousin's room was at the end of a hallway on the 2nd floor. Directly across from her bedroom was another room that nobody really used. It had become more of a storage room over the years. It was filled with cardboard boxes, old furniture, random household items, and things that had been packed away for so long that nobody seemed to remember what was inside them. As kids, we usually ignored that room. It wasn't locked or anything like that, but it always felt a little creepy, simply because it was dark and cluttered. That evening, my cousin and I were upstairs in her room, playing like we always did. I don't remember exactly what we were doing, probably playing with toys, or making up games the way kids do when they're left alone for hours. We completely lost track of time until my uncle called up the stairs. "Dinner's ready." My cousin immediately ran toward the hallway. Like most kids, I wasn't in any hurry. I stayed behind for another few seconds, picking something up and generally wasting time before finally deciding to head downstairs. By then, everyone else had already gone ahead. I was the last person upstairs. I stepped out into the hallway. The lights were on in the hallway itself, but the storage room across from us was completely dark. As I started walking toward the stairs, something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement inside the dark room. I stopped. At first, I figured my eyes were simply adjusting to the darkness. I stood there looking into the room, trying to see what had moved. Because the lights were off, most of the room was hidden in shadows. I could only make out the vague shapes of stacked boxes and old furniture. For a second, nothing happened. Then, someone walked across the room. To this day, I can still picture it perfectly. It was a figure wearing an orange orangutan costume, not a realistic one. One of those cheap Halloween costumes made from thin fabric with fake, scratchy-looking fur. The kind you might find in a costume store years ago. It wasn't running. It wasn't sneaking. It simply walked calmly across the room. The entire time, it was looking directly at me. That's the part I remember most. Its head never turned away. It just stared at me while walking across the darkness. Everything inside me froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think. For what was probably only a second or two, my body completely locked up. Then survival instinct finally took over. I turned around and ran. I flew down the stairs faster than I ever had before. I don't even remember touching half the steps. By the time I reached the bottom, I was completely panicked. I started yelling for my uncle. I honestly can't remember exactly what I said. I was so scared that my words probably didn't make much sense. I just remember trying desperately to explain that there was someone upstairs. My uncle looked confused. Then he smiled the way adults often do when a frightened child tells them something unbelievable. He didn't believe me. He probably assumed I'd seen shadows or imagined something in the dark. Nobody ran upstairs. Nobody searched the room. Instead, everyone simply sat down and ate dinner. I tried calming down, but it wasn't easy. The image of that costume kept replaying in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about the way it had looked directly at me. It wasn't the costume itself that frightened me the most. It was the feeling that someone had been inside that room watching me. The rest of the evening passed without anything else happening. Eventually, I was taken back home. Life continued as normal. No one ever mentioned the incident again. As I grew older, I tried coming up with logical explanations. Maybe there really had been a costume hanging on something inside the room, and my young imagination made it seem like it moved. Maybe shifting light from the hallway created an illusion. Maybe one of the adults had stored an old Halloween costume in the room without me knowing. Or maybe my brain mixed together shadows, stacked boxes, and fear into something that felt completely real. All of those explanations seem possible. In fact, I'd like to believe one of them is correct. But there's one part I still struggle to explain. I don't remember seeing a costume hanging there. I remember seeing it walk. I remember it crossing the room from one side to the other. Most of all, I remember it looking directly at me the entire time. That memory has never changed. When I think back on it today, I know I was only a child. Children can misunderstand what they see, especially in dark rooms. Our imaginations are incredibly powerful. On top of that, I grew up watching horror movies that most kids my age probably shouldn't have been watching. My family didn't really shield me from scary movies, so by the time I was 10, I'd already seen plenty of things that probably influenced my imagination. I'm sure that didn't help. At the time, though, none of those thoughts crossed my mind. I was completely convinced that something dangerous had been waiting in that room. I honestly believed I was about to die. That sounds dramatic now, but that's exactly how frightened I felt. Even though decades have passed, I still notice my heart racing whenever I tell the story. It's strange how certain childhood memories stay with you. You forget hundreds of ordinary days, but one moment of absolute fear remains crystal clear forever. Whether I witnessed something real, misunderstood what I saw, or experienced nothing more than a child's terrified imagination, I honestly don't know. I only know what I remember. I remember being the last one upstairs. I remember looking into a dark room filled with boxes. I remember an orange orangutan costume calmly walking across that room while staring directly at me. Then, I remember running for my life. Whatever actually happened that evening, it's a memory that has never completely left me, and even now, it still gives me heart palpitations every time I think about it. This is one of those stories that I've only told a handful of times in my life. Most people either laugh it off or immediately try to explain it away, and honestly, I don't blame them. I don't claim that I saw an alien spacecraft or anything like that. I have no idea what my wife and I witnessed that night. I've spent years trying to come up with a logical explanation, and while I have a few possibilities, none of them completely fit what we saw. Even after all these years, I still can't explain it. This happened sometime in the late 1980s. My wife and I were out riding our motorcycle on a very warm summer night. It had been one of those evenings where the air stayed comfortable long after the sun had gone down. We weren't in any hurry to get home, so we decided to enjoy the ride while the roads were quiet. Eventually, we pulled into a small parking area beside the road. There weren't any streetlights nearby, and the place was completely dark except for the natural light from the stars overhead. We mainly stopped so we could stretch our legs for a few minutes before continuing the ride. After getting off the motorcycle, we stood there for a while, enjoying the silence. Without city lights nearby, the night sky looked incredible. Thousands of stars were visible. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, and we both found ourselves doing what people often do in places like that, simply looking up and admiring everything above us. Neither of us was looking for anything unusual. We were just enjoying the view. As we stood there, I noticed what looked like another small point of light among the stars. At first, I assumed it was simply another star. Then I realized it was moving. It wasn't especially bright. It looked almost exactly like every other star in the sky, except for the fact that it was slowly traveling across the darkness. My first thought was that it had to be a satellite. I'd seen satellites before, quietly crossing the night sky in a straight line. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. As I continued watching, I realized my wife was staring at the exact same object. Neither of us said anything. We simply watched it move. For several moments, everything appeared completely normal. The light continued traveling steadily in one direction. Then, something happened that immediately caught both of our attention. Without any warning, the object suddenly changed course. It made a sharp turn to the left, not a gradual curve, a sudden change in direction. It continued traveling that way for a short distance. We both kept watching, trying to understand what we were seeing. Then it happened again. This time, instead of making another gentle turn, the light suddenly shot off in a completely different direction. The movement was incredibly fast. One instant it was there. The next instant it accelerated across the sky so quickly that it simply disappeared from view. There wasn't any fading, no blinking lights, no explosion, no trail. It was just gone for a second. Neither of us said anything. Then, almost at the same time, we turned toward each other. Did you see that? That was the first question either of us asked. The answer came immediately. We had both seen exactly the same thing. That was probably the part that stayed with me the most. If I'd been alone, I would have assumed I'd misunderstood what I was looking at. Maybe I'd mistaken two different objects for one. Maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. But my wife had watched the entire thing too. Without either of us saying a word beforehand, we both described the same unusual movements. Neither of us had an explanation. To be honest, we didn't spend much time standing there afterward. Whatever we'd seen had unsettled both of us. We got back on the motorcycle almost immediately. Neither of us suggested staying longer. We simply started the bike and left. As we rode away, we talked about it for a while, trying to make sense of what we'd witnessed. We considered every explanation we could think of. Could it have been an airplane? It didn't have navigation lights. Could it have been a helicopter? It moved far too quickly during that final change in direction. Could it have been a satellite? That was probably the explanation I wanted to believe the most. But every satellite I'd ever seen traveled in a smooth, predictable path. They don't suddenly turn left before instantly accelerating in another direction. At least, not any that I'm aware of. People today might immediately suggest a drone. That would certainly be one of the first explanations. The problem is that this happened in the late 1980s. Consumer drones didn't exist the way they do today. Whatever we saw wasn't someone flying a quadcopter for fun. That simply wasn't an option back then. Over the years, I've occasionally revisited the memory. Every time I do, I try approaching it from a different perspective. Could atmospheric conditions have created some kind of optical illusion? Could I have mistaken multiple objects for one moving light? Could there be some rare astronomical explanation that I simply don't understand? I'm certainly open to those possibilities. In fact, I'd prefer one of them to be true. I've never been someone who jumps to extraordinary conclusions. Just because I can't explain something doesn't automatically mean it has an extraordinary explanation. Sometimes people simply witness things they don't understand. That's okay. Not every mystery has to become proof of something extraordinary. Still, I can't ignore one simple fact. Both my wife and I saw the exact same object. We both watched it make the same sudden turns. We both watched it disappear. Neither of us influenced the other's memory because we reacted at the exact same moment. After that night, we didn't really talk about it very often. In fact, we hardly mentioned it at all. Partly because we didn't have any answers. Partly because we knew how unbelievable it sounded. Whenever conversations about unidentified flying objects came up over the years, we usually stayed quiet. It wasn't because we were hiding some incredible secret. We simply didn't feel like arguing with people over something we couldn't explain ourselves. I've never claimed that I saw visitors from another world. I honestly don't know what it was. The truth is much less dramatic. I saw a small point of light moving through the night sky. It suddenly changed direction in a way that didn't make sense to me. Then, it accelerated so quickly that it vanished. That's all I can honestly say. Whether there was a perfectly ordinary explanation or not, I have no idea. My brain still prefers the satellite explanation because it feels comfortable and familiar. At the same time, satellites don't behave the way this object did. That's the part I've never been able to reconcile. So after all these years, I still don't have an answer. Only a memory. A warm summer night. A quiet roadside parking area. A sky full of stars. One strange point of light. And two people who looked at each other afterward, equally confused, before deciding it was time to get back on the motorcycle and leave. I've never seen anything like it again. I've never tried to convince anyone that it was something extraordinary. I simply know what my wife and I witnessed that night. And even now, decades later, it's still one of the few experiences in my life that I genuinely cannot explain. One of the strangest experiences I've ever had happened in a house we used to own. Even now, years after moving away, I still don't know how to explain it. I've tried to come up with logical answers for everything that happened there, but some parts of the story simply don't fit any explanation I've been able to find. The interesting thing is that I wasn't even the one who saw the most unsettling part. If you knew my husband and me, you'd probably expect the opposite. Our personalities couldn't be more different. I'm the kind of person who's fascinated by strange stories, old houses, and unexplained mysteries. I've always had a big imagination, and I'm open to the possibility that not everything in life has an obvious answer. My husband is the complete opposite. He's one of the most logical people I've ever met. He questions everything. He always looks for evidence before believing something. If something unusual happens, his first instinct is to find a practical explanation. He's never been interested in ghost stories or anything paranormal. That's one of the reasons this experience has stayed with me for so long. If it had happened only to me, I probably would have questioned my own memory. But it happened to him. One evening, we were relaxing in the living room after work. I was sitting on the couch with my phone, trying to decide what we wanted for dinner. Eventually, we agreed to order takeout. While I was calling the restaurant to place our order, my husband was sitting on the floor directly in front of me, playing with our dog Walker. Everything felt completely ordinary. I was focused on the conversation with the restaurant. My husband was tossing a toy for Walker and laughing while the dog chased after it. Then, something changed. Walker suddenly stopped moving. Completely, he wasn't distracted by another toy. He wasn't looking toward a window. He froze. His eyes locked onto the doorway connecting our living room to the dining room. At almost the exact same moment, my husband stopped playing too. He slowly turned around and looked directly toward that same doorway. Then, he looked back at me. The expression on his face immediately caught my attention. He looked completely confused. Not frightened, just genuinely bewildered. I remember thinking he must have been reacting to something I had said while ordering dinner. Maybe I'd accidentally ordered the wrong food. Maybe I'd forgotten something. I couldn't imagine what else would have caused that expression. I finished placing the order, thanked the restaurant employee, and hung up. Then I turned to him. What was that look for? He kept staring at me for a second. Then he asked a question that completely caught me off guard. You didn't see her? I honestly had no idea what he was talking about. What? You didn't see her? His voice sounded completely serious. I asked, see who? He looked back toward the doorway. The woman. He pointed toward the opening between the living room and dining room. She was standing right there. Then he added something that made the situation even stranger. Walker saw her too. I looked at our dog. He was still staring at the doorway. His attention hadn't moved. The hair along his back was slightly raised, and he seemed completely focused on that empty space. My husband began describing exactly what he'd seen. According to him, an elderly woman had walked into the doorway. What immediately stood out was where she had come from. She entered from the right side of the doorway. The problem was, that wasn't possible. The right side wasn't another room. It was an exterior wall with windows. There was no hallway, no doorway, no place for a person to enter. Yet he insisted that's exactly where she appeared. She calmly walked into the doorway, stopped there for several seconds, looked around, then turned and walked back in the exact same direction she had come from, toward a solid wall. Then she disappeared. He described her in remarkable detail. She had short, curly white hair. She was wearing brown pants, a green cardigan, black loafers. He even remembered the style of her shoes. While he was telling me all of this, he held out his arms. They were completely covered in goosebumps. I'd never seen him react that way before. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. He genuinely couldn't understand what he'd just witnessed. Nothing else happened that night. Walker eventually relaxed. Life returned to normal. The strange thing is that my husband never saw the woman again. I never saw her at all. That should have been the end of the story. Instead, something else began happening. It wasn't as dramatic as seeing someone standing in the doorway, but it was much more persistent. Late at night, usually sometime after 11 o'clock, we would begin hearing music. Not every night, not even every week. It happened completely at random. The music always seemed to come from one particular wall in our living room. It wasn't loud. It was fairly quiet. But it was impossible to ignore once you noticed it. The best way to describe it is elevator music. The kind of soft instrumental music you might hear while shopping at a grocery store, sitting in a doctor's office, or waiting on hold during a phone call. Nothing dramatic. Nothing creepy by itself, just calm background music. Except it was coming from inside our wall. Whenever it started, it would continue for an hour, or sometimes even 2. Eventually, curiosity got the better of us. We became determined to figure out where it was coming from. At first, we assumed one of our electronics was somehow responsible. Maybe a radio, maybe a speaker. Maybe something accidentally left on. We turned everything off. The music continued. Then we started unplugging devices. Still playing. Eventually, we shut off every electronic we could think of. Nothing changed. The music kept going. At that point, we started wondering whether the sound might somehow be coming from another house. But that didn't seem right either. It always sounded as though it was inside that specific wall. The layout of the house made the situation even stranger. On one side of the wall was our living room. On the other side was the staircase leading down to the basement. There wasn't another room hiding behind it. The sound seemed trapped inside the wall itself. Trying to solve the mystery eventually became almost an obsession. The history of the house only made us more curious. The home had originally been built in 1942 by the man who had lived there with his wife. Sadly, she passed away only a few years after the house was completed. Later, he remarried. According to people who knew him, he eventually developed some unusual beliefs. He became fascinated with homing pigeons, not simply raising them. He apparently believed they could somehow communicate with him through radio frequencies or similar signals. Whether that story was completely accurate, I don't know. But that's what we had been told. After he eventually passed away, we bought the house from his second wife. With all that history in mind, we became even more determined to solve the mystery of the music. One night, while it was playing again, we decided to eliminate every possible source of electricity. We went to the breaker panel. One by one, we shut off the circuits. Eventually, we flipped every breaker we safely could. the music never stopped. Standing there in the dark house, listening to soft instrumental music still drifting through the wall, was one of the strangest moments I've ever experienced. Since we couldn't find the source electrically, we decided to physically inspect the wall. From the basement side, we carefully drilled a few small inspection holes. Using a telescoping camera, we searched inside the wall. We expected to find something: an old speaker, a forgotten radio, hidden wiring, anything. Instead, all we found was some old electrical wiring that wasn't connected to anything anymore. There was nothing capable of producing sound. We spent hours searching. We never found an explanation. For as long as we lived in that house, the music continued appearing from time to time. Always late at night, always from the same wall, always disappearing on its own after an hour or two. Then, a few years ago, we moved away. The music stopped, not because we solved the mystery, but because we no longer lived there. My husband never saw the elderly woman again. I never saw her at all. Still, every now and then, I'll come across an old photograph of that house. Whenever I see the doorway between the living room and the dining room, I immediately remember my husband describing the woman who calmly walked out from a solid wall, stood silently for a few seconds, and disappeared the same impossible way she had arrived. Then, I remember Walker staring at the empty doorway, with his back slightly raised. And finally, I remember all those late nights, standing in a silent house, listening to soft music playing from inside a wall that, as far as we could tell, contained nothing capable of making a sound. I still don't know what happened in that house. Maybe every event had a perfectly ordinary explanation that we simply never found. I'd actually like to believe that, but after everything we experienced there, it's one place I'll never be able to think about without feeling a chill run down my spine. Compared to some of the stories people tell, this might not sound like the scariest experience in the world. But for me, it was easily one of the most terrifying moments of my life. Even though everything turned out okay in the end, the image of that night is something I don't think I'll ever forget. To understand what happened, a little background helps. I'm a fairly new father. Our son is just over a year old now. He's reached the age where he's curious about everything, but he's still completely dependent on either me or my wife. Like most parents with a young child, we've been running on very little sleep for a long time. We're exhausted most days. Happy, but exhausted. Because of that, my wife and I had recently started sleeping in separate bedrooms for a while. I have ADHD, and I've always moved around a lot before falling asleep. I toss, turn, get comfortable, then move again. On top of that, I wake up much earlier than my wife because of work. Every time I climbed into bed late or got up early, I risked waking both her and our son. After several sleepless nights, we decided it would be easier if I slept in another room until our son's sleep became more predictable. It wasn't because anything was wrong between us. It was simply the most practical solution for two tired parents trying to survive the first years of raising a child. The day before everything happened, my wife wasn't feeling well. She had caught a cold. She looked tired all day and didn't have much energy. That evening we had shashlik for dinner, and afterward she told me she was feeling even worse than before. She said she was exhausted and wanted to go to bed early. I asked if she needed anything before she went to sleep. Medicine, water, tea, anything at all. She smiled and told me she was fine. She just wanted to rest. So we both headed to our separate rooms for the night. I figured she'd sleep it off and hopefully feel better in the morning. One thing about me is that I'm diabetic. Every now and then I experience episodes of low blood sugar, especially during the night. It's something I've learned to manage over the years. Usually, if I wake up feeling the symptoms, I simply go to the kitchen, get some glucose, wait a few minutes, and go back to bed. That night was no different. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, I woke up because my blood sugar had dropped. Still half asleep, I walked to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, grabbed some glucose, and waited until I started feeling normal again. Then, I went back to bed. Within a few minutes, I drifted back to sleep. I don't know exactly how much time passed. Suddenly, a loud crash exploded through the house. It was so loud that it instantly pulled me awake. For a split second, I honestly thought one of the kitchen wall cabinets had somehow fallen off the wall. The sound was that violent. I jumped out of bed immediately. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something else. The hallway light was on. That immediately felt wrong. Then another thought hit me. The baby. My heart started racing. My first instinct was that something had happened to our son. Without stopping to think, I hurried toward the hallway. Then I realized the bathroom light was on too. I walked toward it. The moment I reached the doorway, I froze. My wife was lying face down on the bathroom floor. There was blood around her. She was having convulsions. For a moment, it felt like my brain completely stopped working. People always say that in emergencies you need to stay calm. Paramedics repeat it. Doctors repeat it. Movies make it look easy. The reality felt completely different. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't running in circles. But inside my head, absolute panic had taken over. My body was shaking so badly I could barely think. 100 thoughts hit me at once. Oh my God, she hit her head. Is her skull fractured? Is she dying? Our son. What if he grows up without his mother? What am I supposed to do? Am I about to become a single father? Those thoughts all happened within seconds. I dropped to the floor beside her immediately. The first thing I did was carefully turn her face upward. That's when I realized the blood wasn't coming from a head wound. Her nose had taken the impact. It was obviously broken, and blood was pouring from it. As horrifying as it looked, I immediately felt a tiny bit of relief knowing I couldn't see an obvious skull fracture. She was still unconscious. I kept talking to her, calling her name, trying to wake her. It probably took only 30 seconds before she finally started responding, but at the time it felt much longer. Eventually, she slowly regained consciousness. She looked completely confused, disoriented, weak. As we tried piecing together what had happened, it became obvious that she had fainted while sitting on the toilet. She'd been suffering from diarrhea, probably because of whatever illness or stomach problem she was fighting, and she must have lost consciousness while sitting there. When she fainted, she fell forward and hit her face on the floor. She was still extremely nauseous. She could barely move. We called an ambulance immediately. The wait for the paramedics felt endless, even though it probably wasn't very long. When they arrived, they examined her, stabilized her, and took her to the hospital. I stayed behind with our son, trying to process everything that had just happened. Those hours were some of the longest of my life. Thankfully, after a full medical evaluation, the doctors gave us good news. She was going to be okay. They checked her heart, her blood pressure, her overall condition. Everything looked normal. The doctors believed it had been a combination of factors. She already had a cold. She'd probably reacted badly to something we ate that evening. On top of that, we were both completely exhausted from the non-stop demands of caring for a young child. All those things together were apparently enough to make her faint. Apart from her broken nose and some bruising, she recovered well. Today she's completely healthy. Life eventually returned to normal. But even though she recovered physically, I don't think that night will ever completely leave me. There are certain images your mind refuses to forget. For me, it's opening that bathroom door and seeing the woman I love lying face down on the floor surrounded by blood. Logically, I know she survived. I know she's healthy. I know the outcome could have been much worse. But in those first few seconds, before I understood what had happened, I truly believed I might be losing her. That feeling is impossible to describe unless you've lived through it. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same image again. Even now, whenever I hear a loud crash somewhere in the house after everyone's asleep, my heart still skips a beat before I remind myself that everything is okay. Some memories fade with time, others stay with you forever. I have a feeling this one always will. Back when I was younger, our family only had one computer, and the internet worked very differently from the way it does now. If we wanted to go online, the computer had to be connected through a phone line. Every time someone wanted to use the internet, we had to plug everything in and wait for that strange dialing sound before the connection finally worked. It felt completely normal back then. But looking back now, it seems like a different world. The computer wasn't in a bedroom or a living room where everyone spent time. Instead, it sat in the basement. The basement itself wasn't completely unfinished or dirty, but it always felt different from the rest of the house. It was colder, quieter, and somehow darker, even during the day. The lights never seemed bright enough to chase away all the shadows hiding in the corners. The computer desk had been pushed into one particular corner that I always thought looked creepy. Nobody else in my family seemed bothered by it, but I never liked sitting there for very long. The ceiling felt lower than the rest of the house. The concrete floor stayed cold, no matter what season it was, and every little sound echoed through the room. Even when nothing strange was happening, the basement always made me feel like someone could be standing just outside the light, watching without making a sound. It wasn't something I could explain. It was simply a feeling I had every time I went downstairs by myself. Still, I loved using the computer, so I usually ignored that uneasy feeling. One evening, I was home alone. My parents were out, and my brother wasn't home either. The house was completely quiet except for the occasional creak that old houses naturally make. I wasn't thinking about ghosts or scary stories. I was just excited to spend some uninterrupted time on the computer. I went downstairs, turned everything on, waited for the internet connection to work, and signed into Miss Messenger. Back then, chatting with friends online was one of the best parts of the day. We'd talk about school, games, funny videos, or whatever had happened that week. Hours could disappear without me even noticing. Once I started chatting, I became completely focused on the screen. The only sounds around me were the computer fan quietly humming, the clicking of the keyboard, and the occasional tapping of the mouse. Every now and then, I could hear the house settling above me, but I paid almost no attention to it. Behind me, sitting against the wall, was one of my brother's remote control toys. I don't even remember exactly what kind it was anymore. It may have been a small car or another vehicle, but I knew it hadn't been touched in quite a while. It had simply been left there after he finished playing with it. I never gave it a second thought. I kept talking to my friends online, laughing at the messages appearing on the screen and typing back as quickly as I could. Everything felt completely normal. Then, without any warning, I heard a sound behind me. At first, it was soft enough that I almost ignored it. I paused my typing for a second and listened. Before I could even decide what I had heard, the sound came again. This time it was louder. It sounded exactly like plastic wheels moving across the basement floor. I slowly turned my head. The remote control toy behind me had started moving, Not just a tiny twitch. It actually rolled across the floor. For a second, my brain completely froze. I remember staring at it without understanding what I was looking at. Then the thought hit me all at once. What the? I jumped in my chair. My heart immediately started racing. The first explanation that came into my mind seemed reasonable enough. Maybe my family had come home without me hearing them. Maybe my brother had quietly walked downstairs and decided to scare me. That sounded far more believable than anything else. I even started feeling annoyed instead of scared. I expected someone to burst out laughing at any second. So I quickly looked around the basement. Nobody. I listened carefully. No footsteps, no voices, no laughter. Just silence. The toy moved again. I stared directly at it this time. It wasn't shaking from vibration. It wasn't sliding because the floor was uneven. It was actually moving the way it would if someone were controlling it. Then my eyes noticed something that made my stomach drop. The remote control was lying right beside the toy. It wasn't in anyone's hand. It wasn't across the room. It was literally sitting next to the toy on the floor. I couldn't stop looking at it. The toy. The remote. The toy again. Nothing about it made sense. I remember thinking that maybe the buttons had somehow been pressed down. Maybe something heavy was resting on them. Maybe the batteries were dying and causing it to act strangely. I searched for every possible explanation, but from where I was sitting, I couldn't see anything touching the remote at all. The basement suddenly felt much colder. The silence became overwhelming. Every tiny sound seemed louder than before. I realized I was completely alone. There wasn't another person anywhere in the house. That uncomfortable feeling I always had about that corner suddenly came rushing back much stronger than ever before. I could almost feel the hairs standing up on the back of my neck. I kept waiting for the toy to stop. Instead, it made another small movement. That was enough. I wanted out. The only problem was that the basement stairs were on the opposite side of the room. To reach them, I had to run right past the toy. I hated that thought. Every instinct told me to stay exactly where I was, but staying there felt even worse. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the toy the entire time. It didn't move. I took one careful step. Still nothing. Another step. The room felt unbelievably quiet. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. As I got closer, I couldn't stop staring at the remote lying beside it. I almost expected the toy to suddenly shoot forward again. Nothing happened. I reached the point where I couldn't avoid passing it anymore. For 1 second, I completely froze. Then, I sprinted. I ran as fast as I possibly could. My shoes slammed against the concrete floor as I rushed toward the stairs. I didn't dare look back. I practically jumped up the steps 2 at a time until I reached the main floor. Only after I slammed the basement door behind me did I finally stop running. I stood there breathing hard, trying to calm myself down. I kept listening for any sounds coming from downstairs. Nothing. The house was quiet again. For the rest of the evening, I stayed upstairs. I didn't go back into the basement unless someone else was with me. Even then, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. Part of me kept trying to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there had been some strange electrical issue. Maybe the toy had malfunctioned. Maybe I had imagined how much it moved because I panicked. But another part of me couldn't ignore one important detail. The remote had been sitting right beside the toy. No one had been holding it. No one had been anywhere near it. When my mom eventually came home, I told her exactly what had happened. I explained everything from the beginning. I told her I had been chatting online. I told her I heard the noise. I described how the toy started moving. I even told her about seeing the remote lying next to it instead of in someone's hand. I expected her to be surprised. Maybe she'd check the batteries. Maybe she'd come downstairs with me to see if something was wrong. Instead, she barely reacted. She simply brushed it off. She acted like it wasn't a big deal at all. She suggested there was probably some simple explanation and told me not to worry about it. That was it. The conversation ended almost as quickly as it started. I remember feeling frustrated because it had been one of the scariest moments I had ever experienced. To me, it wasn't something that could be dismissed so easily. Even today, years later, I still think about that night whenever someone talks about strange experiences. I'm not claiming it was anything supernatural. I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe there really was some weird mechanical problem that made the toy move on its own. Maybe there was an explanation I simply couldn't see from where I was sitting, but no explanation has ever completely satisfied me. What stays with me the most isn't even the toy itself. It's the feeling I had in that basement. The silence. The cold air. The creepy corner where the computer sat. The moment I turned around and saw something that absolutely shouldn't have been moving. And the image that never left my mind was seeing the remote resting harmlessly beside the toy while the toy itself rolled across the floor as if someone invisible had decided to play with it. Whenever I remember that night, I always come back to the same question. If nobody was there and the remote wasn't even being touched, then what exactly made that toy move? I've only shared this story with a handful of people because, even now, I'm not completely sure what to make of it. I know how unusual it sounds, and I understand why some people might not believe it. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm simply sharing what I experienced because, whether there was a logical explanation or not, these moments felt very real to me. They happened over the course of a couple of years, and every one of them left a lasting impression. A few years ago, before I started college, I became very serious about my Christian faith. I had always believed in God, but during that time I wanted to grow closer to Him. I made it a habit to read my Bible every day. I spent more time praying than I ever had before, and I genuinely wanted to strengthen my relationship with God. Life was simpler then. I had more free time, and reading scripture became part of my daily routine. Some days I would spend a long time reading, thinking about what I had learned, and praying afterward. It brought me peace, and I felt like I was moving in the right direction spiritually. Since starting college, I've struggled to keep that same routine. Classes, assignments, and everything else that comes with college life made it harder to stay consistent. I eventually drifted away from reading my Bible every day, something I'm still trying to correct. I've been making an effort to take my faith seriously again, but every time I think back to that earlier period. I also remember the strange experiences that happened around the same time. The first experience was the one that frightened me the most. One evening, I was alone in my room, praying. It wasn't a quick prayer before going to bed. I had been praying for quite a while, speaking honestly and spending time with God. The room was completely quiet. There wasn't any music playing, and there weren't any distractions around me. Everything felt normal. Then, without any warning, I heard a voice. It wasn't a distant sound, and it didn't seem like it came from somewhere else in the room. It sounded incredibly close, almost as if someone had leaned right next to my ear and whispered directly into it. The words were very clear. I remember hearing something like, "Stop talking to him." I can't say with complete certainty that those were the exact words, but it was definitely something very close to that. The message was unmistakable. It felt like whatever I heard wanted me to stop praying immediately. What terrified me even more than the words was the voice itself. It didn't sound like anyone I knew. It was deep, rough, and incredibly dark. There was something about it that instantly filled me with fear. I had never heard anything like it before, and I've never forgotten the way it sounded. The moment I heard it, my heart started pounding. I jumped up as fast as I could and turned on every light in my room. Suddenly, I didn't want to be in the dark anymore. Every shadow made me nervous, and every quiet moment felt uncomfortable. Even though I was scared, I decided not to stop praying. If anything, I prayed even harder than before. I stayed awake for a long time afterward because I couldn't calm myself down. I kept replaying those words in my head, wondering whether I had actually heard them, or whether my mind had somehow imagined the whole thing. No matter how many times I thought about it, the memory felt real. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about that voice. Eventually, life returned to normal, and although the memory stayed with me, nothing unusual happened for a while. Then the second experience happened. One day I was sitting at my computer talking with friends on Discord. We were chatting about random things, laughing, and just hanging out like we usually did. It was a completely ordinary evening. While we were talking, I suddenly remembered that I hadn't read my Bible that day. Without really thinking about it, I said out loud, "I haven't read my Bible yet." The words had barely left my mouth before something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like a dark figure appear near the edge of my bed. It wasn't standing in the middle of the room, and I didn't get a long look at it. It happened so quickly that it almost felt like a flash. The figure looked completely black. There were no facial features that I could make out. It looked more like the outline of a person than an actual person. It was simply a dark shape that appeared for a brief moment. My heart immediately skipped a beat. As soon as I turned my head to look directly at it, it disappeared. There was nothing there. The room looked exactly the way it always had. I sat there frozen for several seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if it had simply been my imagination. Maybe I had mistaken a shadow for something else. Maybe my eyes had played a trick on me. But it had felt so sudden and so clear that I couldn't easily dismiss it. I remember feeling extremely uncomfortable after that. I stopped what I was doing almost immediately. Instead of continuing to chat online, I grabbed my Bible and started reading. Whether the timing was just a coincidence or not, I wasn't willing to ignore what had happened. Reading my Bible made me feel calmer, and after a while, my fears slowly faded. Still, the experience stayed with me. The third event happened sometime later, and in some ways it was the strangest of them all. It was the middle of the night. I suddenly woke up at around 2 in the morning. I was lying flat on my back, staring into the darkness. Normally, if I wake up during the night, I can fall asleep again within a few minutes. That night was different. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't fall back asleep. I kept closing my eyes and trying to relax, but sleep simply wouldn't come. The room was silent. Everything seemed completely still. Then I started hearing footsteps. For some context, my bedroom was directly below the attic. At first, I wondered if maybe someone had gone up there for some reason. But the footsteps didn't sound normal. They were slow. Very slow. Back and forth. Over and over again. It sounded like someone was pacing across the floor above my room. The sound continued without stopping. Every step seemed deliberate. Instead of opening my eyes to investigate, I kept them tightly shut. I don't know why, but I had absolutely no desire to look around the room. Something inside me told me to keep my eyes closed. The only thing I could think to do was pray. So, that's exactly what I did. Silently, Over and over again, I prayed while listening to those footsteps continue above me. Every minute felt much longer than it probably was. The room felt colder than usual. I became painfully aware of every sound around me. I could hear my own breathing. I could feel my heart beating faster than normal. The footsteps continued at the same slow pace. Back and forth, back and forth. I have no idea how long it lasted exactly, but if I had to guess, it was around 10 minutes. Then something happened that I still have trouble explaining. Suddenly, I felt an intense wave of cold spread through my entire body. It wasn't like the room had become colder. It felt as though something had moved straight through me. The sensation lasted only a brief moment, but it was strong enough that I still remember it years later. Immediately after that happened, I lost consciousness almost instantly. It wasn't like slowly drifting off to sleep. One moment I was awake. The next moment I was completely gone. When I opened my eyes again, sunlight was coming through the window. My alarm was going off. It was time to get ready for school. The entire night felt almost unreal, but the memory remained vivid. Even after all this time, I can still remember every detail. I remember the footsteps. I remember refusing to open my eyes. I remember praying through the fear. Most of all, I remember that sudden wave of cold that passed through my body before I fell asleep. Looking back now, I still don't know exactly what happened during any of those experiences. I'm not saying I have all the answers. Maybe there were explanations I simply didn't understand at the time. Maybe stress, lack of sleep, or something else played a role. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that every one of those moments felt completely real while I was experiencing them. They weren't dreams that I remembered after waking up. At the time, they felt like they were happening right in front of me. Those experiences left me feeling nervous for a long time. Even today, whenever I think back to that period of my life, I still feel uneasy. I've become much more cautious whenever I hear unexplained sounds at night or notice something strange out of the corner of my eye. Whether there's a simple explanation or not, those memories have stayed with me. I'm still trying to rebuild the habits I once had with my faith and become more consistent again. At the same time, I can't forget those strange moments that happened while I was taking my faith more seriously. To this day, I still don't know exactly what I experienced. All I know is that those nights were some of the creepiest moments of my life, and they're memories I've never been able to fully explain or forget. When I was a little kid, there was something about our house that always frightened me. It wasn't because it was old or falling apart. In fact, my parents' home was a perfectly normal place to live. During the day, it felt warm and comfortable, and there were plenty of happy memories there. But there was one part of the house that always made me uneasy, and I could never explain why. I used to tell my parents over and over that there was a ghost living in our house. Of course, they never believed me. Like most parents, they assumed I simply had an active imagination. Children often imagine monsters under the bed or strange things hiding in dark corners, so they didn't think much of what I was saying. They would smile, tell me everything was fine, and try to reassure me that there was nothing to worry about. But I wasn't making it up. At least, I didn't think I was. There was one particular place where I would see something again and again. Our house had a staircase that led from the downstairs area up into the living room. Whenever I was sitting downstairs, I had a clear view toward the top of the stairs. From where I usually sat, I could look straight at the doorway that opened into the living room. It happened so many times that I eventually started expecting it. Out of the corner of my eye, I would suddenly catch a flash of white moving past the doorway. It wasn't something that stayed there for several seconds. It was quick. Just a brief glimpse. almost like someone walking past the open doorway without stopping. As a young child, I naturally assumed it was my dad. Every morning before work, my father almost always wore a white dress shirt. That image became so familiar to me that whenever I saw that white movement near the doorway, I immediately believed he had just come home from work. I would get excited. I'd think, Dad's home. Sometimes I would even turn toward my mom and mention that Dad had just walked by. Every single time, though, my mom would tell me exactly the same thing. Your dad is still at work. At first, I figured maybe I had been mistaken. But then, it kept happening. Again, and again, and again. Every time I would see that same white flash move past the doorway. Every time, I'd think it was my father. Every time my mom would remind me that he wasn't even home yet. As I got a little older, I realized that what I was seeing couldn't possibly have been him. That realization didn't make me feel better. If anything, it scared me even more. I started believing that something else was in the house. I couldn't explain what it was. I never clearly saw a face. I never had a conversation with anything. I never watched someone standing in the room. It was always the same thing. A quick flash of white. Always near that doorway. Always gone before I could get a good look. As a child, that was enough to convince me there was a ghost living in our home. I became genuinely afraid of that area of the house. Whenever I had to walk through the living room alone, especially at night, I found myself glancing toward the doorway where I usually saw it. Sometimes I'd hurry through the room just to avoid lingering there. Even though my parents insisted there was nothing to be afraid of, that uneasy feeling never really disappeared. Eventually, as the years passed, life moved on. I grew older. I finished school. I became an adult. Like most childhood fears, those strange memories slowly faded into the background. I still remembered them, but I rarely thought about them anymore. Whenever the topic came up, I'd occasionally mention that, as a kid, I was convinced our house had a ghost. People usually laughed. Sometimes I laughed too. After all, nearly everyone has strange memories from childhood that become less certain over time. Maybe it had simply been my imagination. Maybe changing light, reflections, or my young mind had created something that wasn't really there. I never found an answer. Then, about 45 years later, something happened that brought all of those memories rushing back. My father had become very ill. His health had continued to decline until it became clear that he didn't have much time left. Instead of spending his final moments in a hospital, he was at home. The family gathered around him in the living room where he was resting. Everyone wanted to be close to him. The atmosphere inside the house was incredibly quiet. Nobody spoke very much. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said. We simply wanted him to know he wasn't alone. His breathing had become slow and weak. Each breath seemed harder than the one before. You could feel that everyone in the room understood what was about to happen. His loyal old dog was lying beside him on the bed. She had been with him for years and rarely left his side. She was very old by then. Age had caught up with her, and she even had to wear a diaper because she could no longer control her bladder. Despite her age, she refused to leave him. She remained curled up next to him, as if she somehow understood that these were his final moments. Everyone quietly watched my father. No one wanted to interrupt the silence. The only sounds in the room were his breathing and the occasional sniffle from family members trying not to cry. Then, just seconds before my father took his final breath, something completely unexpected happened. Without warning, the dog suddenly lifted her head. She looked frightened, very frightened. She slowly crawled across the bed on her stomach. She wasn't walking normally. It was almost as though she was trying to stay as low as possible while moving. She came directly toward me. Before I could react, she launched herself into my arms. It surprised everyone. She had never acted like that before. The moment I caught her, I realized she wasn't simply looking for comfort. She was terrified. She pressed herself tightly against me. Her body was shaking uncontrollably. She clung to me with all the strength she had left. Then she turned her head. She stared toward one specific spot in the room, the exact same spot where, as a child, I had spent years seeing that mysterious flash of white, the doorway. She locked her eyes on it and refused to look anywhere else. It wasn't the kind of glance a dog gives when hearing a strange noise. She stared without blinking, without moving, without looking away for even a second. I tried gently encouraging her to settle back onto the bed beside my father. She wouldn't do it. She held on to me as tightly as she possibly could. Her entire body continued trembling. As I held her close, I suddenly felt warmth spreading across my arms. Because she was so frightened, she had urinated. I could actually feel it through her diaper. That alone told me just how terrified she was. This wasn't normal behavior for her. She wasn't acting confused because of old age. She wasn't wandering around aimlessly. She had chosen to leave my father's side only moments before he passed away. She came directly to me. Then, she stared at that exact place, the same place I had watched for years as a child. Seconds later, my father took his final breath. The room became completely still. Everyone's attention shifted to him, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened with the dog. I kept replaying it in my mind. The timing, the fear, the way she refused to stop staring toward that doorway. The connection between that moment and the strange experiences I had as a child felt impossible for me to ignore. For decades, I had wondered whether I had simply imagined those flashes of white. Now, standing there 45 years later, I couldn't help but wonder if I had been seeing something real all along. I can't prove it. I know there are many possible explanations. Some people believe that animals can sense changes in a person's condition before death. Others believe dogs react to smells, sounds, or movements that humans simply don't notice. There may very well be a completely natural explanation for everything that happened. I'm open to that possibility. But it's difficult for me to ignore the incredible coincidence. Out of every place in that room, the dog focused on the exact location that had frightened me throughout my childhood. She looked directly at it. She refused to take her eyes off it. She clung to me as though she believed something was standing there. Ever since that day, I've wondered whether there really was something in my parents' home. Maybe whatever I had been seeing all those years wasn't dangerous. Maybe it had simply been there all along. Sometimes I find myself wondering whether it came to witness my father's passing. Other times, I wonder if it came for a different reason. Perhaps it was there to guide him. Perhaps it was there to escort him peacefully from this life and to whatever comes next. Of course, I'll never know for certain. It's only a thought that has stayed with me ever since that day. One detail makes the mystery even more interesting to me. My parents' house was the very first home built on that piece of land, at least as far back as records from the late 1970s can show. There weren't older houses sitting there before ours. As far as anyone knows, the property was undeveloped before then. If there really was some kind of spirit connected to that place, it couldn't have belonged to someone who lived in the house before us. It would have had to belong to someone connected to the land itself, long before the neighborhood even existed. I'll probably never know the truth. Maybe it was all coincidence. Maybe childhood imagination and an elderly dog's fear happened to line up in an unforgettable way. Or maybe, just maybe, The ghost I kept insisting lived in our house all those years ago really had been there the entire time. Whatever the truth is, one thing has never changed. Every time I think about my father's final moments, I also remember that frightened old dog staring silently at the exact same place where I had spent my childhood believing someone unseen was quietly passing through our home. I've lived in the same bedroom for almost 20 years. It has changed a little over time with different furniture, decorations, and paint, but the basic layout has stayed almost exactly the same. One thing that has never changed is the wall with my closet doors. Instead of regular wooden doors, the closet has two large mirrors that stretch almost from the floor to the top of the doorway. Each mirror is about 7 feet tall, so together they reflect almost my entire bedroom. Growing up, I saw those mirrors every single day. They became such a normal part of the room that I barely noticed them anymore. I knew exactly what they reflected, depending on where I was standing or lying down. If I was in bed, I could see the reflection of most of my room. If I stood near the closet, I could see the bed, the doorway, and almost everything else behind me. Because I had spent so many years in that room, I knew every angle of those mirrors by heart. That's one of the reasons why one particular night has stayed with me for so many years. I was still a kid when it happened. I don't remember my exact age, but I was young enough to still have children's toys packed away around the house. It was just another ordinary night. I had gone to bed like I always did. Nothing unusual had happened during the day, and I wasn't thinking about ghosts, monsters, or anything scary before falling asleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up. It wasn't one of those moments where you're only half asleep and don't know where you are. I became fully aware almost immediately. I knew I was in my bedroom, and I could think clearly. The room was quiet, and everything seemed perfectly normal. As I lay there, I naturally looked toward the mirrored closet doors at the end of the room. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, I realized something in the reflection didn't belong there. My eyes focused on it. Inside the mirror, sitting in the middle of the reflected room, was a small children's table. I recognized it instantly. It was a little Dora the Explorer table that we kept in our basement. There was no question about it. I knew exactly which table it was because I had played with it countless times when I was younger. It had bright colors and was made for little kids. The strange thing was that it wasn't anywhere near my bedroom. It was downstairs in the basement. There was absolutely no reason it should have appeared in my bedroom mirror. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I noticed something even stranger. Someone, or something, was sitting at the table. It wasn't a person. At least, it didn't look like one. It was a large black figure. The best way I can describe it is as a creature completely covered in darkness. It didn't have details that I could clearly make out. It wasn't wearing clothes that I remember seeing, and I don't recall being able to distinguish facial features. It looked almost like a solid black silhouette, darker than everything around it. Despite that, I had the unmistakable feeling that it was looking directly at me. It wasn't moving. It wasn't making any sound. It simply sat there, watching me. The table had 2 places set up. Sitting on top of it was a little tea set. That caught my attention because I recognized it too. It was my toy tea set, the same one that was stored inside my closet. Seeing that made even less sense. The table belonged in the basement. The tea set was inside the closet. Yet somehow, both of them appeared together inside the reflection. I remember looking away from the mirror for a second and scanning my actual room. There was nothing there. No table, no creature, no tea set. Everything in the room looked exactly the way it should have. Then I looked back at the mirrors. They were still there. The reflected room was completely different from the real one. That's what made the whole experience so unsettling. It wasn't as though I had mistaken a jacket hanging over a chair for a person. There wasn't any furniture in my room that could have created those shapes. There weren't any toys sitting where the reflection showed them. Nothing in my bedroom could have reflected into those exact images. I knew my room well enough to be certain of that. For a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming. People sometimes wake up in the middle of dreams, and the mind can play strange tricks. So, I tested myself. I blinked several times. I rubbed my eyes. I looked around the room again. Everything felt completely real. I wasn't confused. I knew where I was. I knew what day it had been before I went to bed. I could think normally. As far as I could tell, I was fully awake. When I looked back at the mirrors, nothing had changed. The creature remained seated. The tea set stayed exactly where it was. The Dora table hadn't moved. Most importantly, the creature continued staring straight at me. Oddly enough, it never behaved aggressively. It didn't stand up. It didn't crawl toward me. It didn't make any threatening gestures. It simply remained sitting in silence. Looking back now, that's one of the strangest parts of the entire experience. It never actually did anything frightening. The fear came entirely from seeing something that simply shouldn't have been there. The moment I realized I was looking at it, my heart dropped. A rush of fear hit me so suddenly that I felt frozen. I couldn't take my eyes off it. At the same time, I didn't want to keep looking. I just lay there in bed, staring at the reflection. Seconds turned into minutes. As far as I can remember, I watched it for at least a couple of minutes. Maybe it was longer. When you're scared, time has a way of feeling much slower. During that entire time, the creature remained completely still. It simply watched me. I don't remember feeling evil coming from it. I don't remember sensing anger. It wasn't smiling. It wasn't reaching toward me. It was just there, almost as if it had been waiting. My mind kept trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Could the mirror somehow be reflecting another room? No, that was impossible. Could moonlight be creating some strange illusion? That didn't make sense either. The level of detail was too specific. I recognized both the table and the tea set immediately. Those weren't random shapes created by shadows. They were objects I actually owned. I considered getting out of bed. Part of me wanted to walk over to the mirror and see what would happen. Another part of me wanted to scream for my parents. But fear won. I decided the safest thing I could possibly do was absolutely nothing. If the creature wasn't moving, maybe I shouldn't move either. Eventually, I came to a simple conclusion. Whatever I was seeing, I didn't want to find out any more about it. So I slowly lay my head back on the pillow. I pulled the blanket up a little higher, closed my eyes, and somehow managed to fall back asleep. When I woke up the next morning, everything was normal. The mirrors reflected exactly what they always had. There was no Dora table, no tea set, no black creature, nothing unusual at all. I checked the basement later. The little Dora table was exactly where it belonged. The tea set was still in the closet. Life went on as though nothing had happened. And strangely enough, I never experienced anything like it again. Not once. I've slept in that same room for many years since then. I've looked into those mirrors thousands of times. I've been awake in the middle of the night more times than I can count. Nothing even remotely similar has ever happened again. Because of that, I've spent years trying to convince myself that it must have been some kind of hallucination. That's the explanation that makes the most sense. Maybe my brain hadn't completely separated dreaming from being awake. Maybe there was some strange visual phenomenon that lasted only a few minutes. Maybe my mind created the entire thing for reasons I'll never understand. The problem is that I don't remember having any reason to hallucinate. I wasn't sick. I didn't have a fever. I wasn't taking medication. I hadn't been watching anything scary before bed. As far as I know, nothing unusual had happened that day. Everything about the night had been completely ordinary until I opened my eyes. Even now, years later, the memory remains incredibly clear. I can still picture the reflection almost perfectly. The little Dora table, the tea set arranged neatly for two, the large black figure sitting quietly across from the empty chair. The way it stared at me without moving, it's one of those memories that has never faded. Oddly enough, my feelings about the experience have changed over time. As a child, it terrified me. For years afterward, I didn't even like thinking about it. But now, looking back as an adult, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had reacted differently. Instead of hiding under the blanket and going back to sleep. What if I had stood up? What if I had walked closer to the mirror? What if I had spoken to it? Would anything have happened? Would the reflection have disappeared? Would I have discovered a perfectly ordinary explanation? Or would the creature have responded somehow? I'll never know. At the time, I made the only decision that felt safe. I went back to sleep. Part of me still believes it was nothing more than a vivid hallucination. Another part of me isn't so sure. After all, I've never been able to explain why I saw objects that weren't even in my room, reflected with such incredible detail, alongside a silent figure that never threatened me, never moved, and never looked away. Whatever it was, whether it was a trick of my mind or something I simply can't explain, it remains one of the strangest and most unforgettable moments I've ever experienced. Even after all these years, whenever I catch my reflection in those old closet mirrors late at night, I still remember that impossible scene and, for just a second, I find myself wondering what I might have seen if I had chosen to keep looking instead of closing my eyes. A few years ago, my husband and I decided to spend a few days hiking in the Rocky Mountains. We both love being outdoors, and whenever we had the chance, we would pack our camping gear and head into the mountains. We had done plenty of hiking before, so this wasn't our first camping trip. We felt prepared and expected it to be another peaceful weekend surrounded by nature. The day started out perfectly. The weather was beautiful, the trails were quiet, and the scenery was exactly what you would expect from the Rockies. Towering mountains stretched across the horizon. Pine trees covered the hillsides, and the air was cool and fresh. It was the kind of place where everything felt calm, and it was easy to forget about the noise and stress of everyday life. Our plan was simple. We had a campsite we intended to reach before dark, set up our tent, cook dinner, and spend the evening relaxing beneath the stars. Unfortunately, things didn't go according to plan. At some point during the hike, we realized we had taken a wrong turn. At first, we weren't too worried. We assumed we could simply backtrack or find the correct trail after checking our map, but the farther we walked, the more uncertain we became. The trails weren't as clearly marked as we expected, and the forest around us looked almost identical in every direction. As the afternoon continued, the sun slowly dropped lower in the sky. That was when we started becoming genuinely concerned. Anyone who spends time hiking knows that everything changes once daylight begins to disappear. Familiar trails become harder to recognize, shadows grow longer, and navigating through unfamiliar terrain becomes much more difficult. We picked up our pace, hoping we'd still find the campground before nightfall. We didn't. Eventually, we had to face reality. The sun was almost gone, and continuing to wander through the mountains in the dark would only increase the chances of getting even more lost. We made the decision to stop where we were. Even though we weren't supposed to camp there, it seemed much safer than trying to continue hiking without enough light to see where we were going. We searched for the flattest patch of ground we could find and quickly set up our tent. By the time we finished, the last bit of daylight had disappeared. The forest became incredibly quiet. There weren't any nearby campers, no campfires, no voices, just the sounds of nature. Despite everything that had happened, we were both exhausted from the long day of hiking. Once we climbed into the tent, my husband was asleep almost immediately. I've always been a lighter sleeper than he is, so while he drifted off within minutes, I remained awake. I wasn't worried anymore. In fact, lying there quietly listening to the sounds of the mountains felt surprisingly peaceful. I could hear insects chirping somewhere nearby. Every now and then a light breeze moved through the trees. Occasionally I heard branches gently rustling against one another. Everything sounded exactly the way you would expect a mountain forest to sound after sunset. I lay there, simply listening. There was something relaxing about being completely surrounded by nature. Then, without any warning, everything changed. A brilliant light suddenly appeared above us. It wasn't a gradual glow. It wasn't distant. One moment the night was completely dark. The next moment, an incredibly bright light illuminated the area around our tent. It was so bright that it immediately caught my full attention. My first thought was completely practical. I assumed it had to be a helicopter. Since we weren't camping in an approved area, I figured maybe a search crew or park officials had spotted us. I imagined a helicopter hovering overhead with a powerful spotlight shining down. That explanation made perfect sense. At least for a few seconds. Then I noticed something that immediately felt wrong. There was no sound, none. Anyone who has ever been near a helicopter knows how loud they are. Even from a considerable distance, you can usually hear the rotor blades long before the aircraft comes into view. This light was directly above us. If it had been a helicopter, the noise should have been overwhelming. Instead, the forest remained completely silent. I listened carefully. Nothing. No engine. No blades. No mechanical sound of any kind. Just silence. That was the moment my confidence in my explanation disappeared. The light also wasn't behaving the way I expected. A helicopter spotlight normally moves. It sweeps across the ground as the aircraft changes position or searches an area. This light remained perfectly still. It didn't drift. It didn't scan the trees. It simply stayed fixed above us. The brightness never changed. The beam remained steady. As I stared upward through the thin fabric of the tent, I felt my entire body tense. Fear slowly replaced confusion. Every instinct told me that something wasn't right. I remember feeling completely frozen. Part of me wanted to unzip the tent and look outside. Another part of me was terrified to do exactly that. I stayed where I was, completely still. The silence somehow made everything feel even more unsettling. I reached over and tried to wake my husband. At first, I gently nudged him. He didn't respond. I whispered his name. Still nothing. I shook him a little harder. He barely moved. Normally, he isn't impossible to wake up, but after such a long day of hiking, he was sleeping incredibly deeply. I kept trying. The whole time, that bright light remained above us. I remember desperately wanting him to wake up so he could see what I was seeing. Part of me wanted confirmation that it wasn't just my imagination, Another part simply didn't want to experience whatever was happening alone. He continued sleeping. The light stayed there for what felt like forever. Looking back now, I think it lasted around 2 minutes. It may not sound like a long time, but when you're lying inside a tent in the middle of the mountains, completely unsure what is happening above you, 2 minutes feels incredibly long. Every second seemed stretched out. I kept expecting to hear something, a helicopter, a vehicle, voices, anything, but the silence never broke. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light disappeared. There was no gradual fading, no movement away from us, no sound of something leaving. It simply turned off. One instant, the area around us was brightly illuminated. The next instant, we were back in complete darkness. The forest returned to exactly the way it had been before. The insects continued chirping. The breeze moved through the trees. Everything seemed normal again. Except I no longer felt relaxed. I stayed awake for a long time after that. Every little sound made me pay attention. I kept expecting the light to return. It never did. Eventually, exhaustion won, and sometime later, I finally fell asleep. The next morning, everything looked ordinary. Sunlight filled the forest. Birds were singing. There wasn't any obvious sign that something unusual had happened during the night. We packed our gear, found the correct trail, and eventually made our way back without any further problems. I asked my husband if he remembered anything unusual from the night before. He didn't. He had slept through the entire experience. He never saw the light. He never heard anything. As far as he knew, it had been a completely normal night of camping. That left me with more questions than answers. Over the years, I've tried to think of every possible explanation. Maybe there really was a helicopter, although I still can't explain why it made absolutely no sound. Maybe there was another source of light that I simply couldn't identify from inside the tent. Maybe there was a natural explanation I didn't understand at the time. I honestly don't know. I'm not claiming I know exactly what happened. I only know what I experienced. A bright, motionless light appeared directly above our tent in the middle of the Rocky Mountains. It remained there in complete silence for around 2 minutes. Then it disappeared just as suddenly as it had arrived. I've spent many nights camping before, and since that trip, I've seen shooting stars, satellites, aircraft, lightning, and plenty of unusual things in the night sky. I've never seen anything else that behaved the way that light did. To this day, whenever I think about that camping trip, I don't remember getting lost nearly as much as I remember lying awake in complete silence, staring upward while an impossibly bright light hovered above our tent without making a single sound before vanishing into the darkness as though it had never been there at all. Back in 2018, I was living in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. At the time, I was renting a large house with 3 roommates. The house was bigger than any place I had lived before, and we all split the rent, which made it affordable. It wasn't anything luxurious, but it had plenty of space, and one of the best parts about it was the backyard. The backyard was completely enclosed by a tall concrete fence that surrounded the property. It gave us a sense of privacy, and my dog loved running around back there during the day. Since the fence was fairly high, I never really worried about him wandering off or anything getting into the yard. Life there was pretty normal. We all had our own schedules, and most evenings were quiet. Sometimes we'd sit outside after work, and other nights, everyone stayed in their rooms doing their own thing. There wasn't anything about the house itself that ever made me think it was haunted or unusual. The experience I'm about to describe was the only strange thing that ever happened while I lived there. It happened one night, when everything seemed completely ordinary. I was inside the house with my dog, relaxing after a long day. I don't remember exactly what I had been doing before it happened, but I know the house was quiet. My roommates were either asleep or in their rooms, and there wasn't much noise coming from outside. Then my dog suddenly changed. Anyone who owns a dog knows they usually react to things in very obvious ways. They'll bark when they hear someone approaching, wag their tail when they're excited, or run toward the door when they want to go outside. This wasn't like any of those reactions. He suddenly became completely still. It happened so quickly that it immediately caught my attention. He stood perfectly rigid, staring through the sliding glass door into the backyard. He wasn't barking. He wasn't growling. He wasn't whining. He wasn't even moving. His entire body seemed frozen. It looked as though every muscle had locked into place. The only thing he was doing was staring. His attention was completely fixed on something outside. I looked at him for a moment, trying to figure out what had gotten his attention. At first, I assumed there was probably a stray cat, another dog, or maybe even an iguana in the yard. That wouldn't have been unusual. Thinking he wanted to go investigate, I walked over to the sliding glass door. I unlocked it and slid it open. Normally, the moment that door opened, my dog would rush outside without hesitation. This time, he didn't move at all. Not even a single step. He remained exactly where he was. Still frozen. Still staring. That was the moment I realized something wasn't right. It wasn't just curiosity. Whatever he was looking at had completely changed his behavior. I looked past him and into the darkness. At first, I couldn't see much. The backyard was mostly dark, with only a little light coming from nearby houses and whatever moonlight happened to be out that night. I narrowed my eyes, trying to make out what had captured his attention. Then I saw it. Perched on top of the concrete fence was something large, very large. At first, it looked almost like a massive shadow, not because it was transparent, but because it appeared almost completely black. I couldn't distinguish many details. There wasn't enough light to clearly identify what it was. I could only make out its outline. It looked much bigger than any bird I had ever seen. For a second, I simply stared, trying to understand what I was looking at. My brain immediately searched for logical explanations. Maybe it was a large owl. Maybe it was some kind of vulture. Maybe the darkness was making it appear much larger than it actually was. Before I could study it any longer, everything happened at once. The creature suddenly launched itself into the air. There was no warning. 1 second, it was sitting on the fence. The next second, it exploded upward into the night sky. What shocked me the most wasn't seeing it fly. It was hearing it. The sound of its wings was unbelievably loud. I've heard birds take off countless times. I've heard pigeons, crows, hawks, and even large birds flying overhead. This sounded nothing like that. Each flap of its wings carried an incredible amount of force. The sound was deep, heavy, powerful. It almost sounded like someone rapidly beating large pieces of thick leather together. The air itself seemed to move with every wing beat. For something that disappeared so quickly, the sound it produced felt enormous. It all happened within a second or two. By the time I fully understood what I had seen, it was already gone. The only thing left behind was that unforgettable sound echoing in my ears. Without even thinking, I grabbed the sliding glass door and slammed it shut as fast as I could. I immediately locked it. My heart was racing. I stood there for several moments, staring through the glass, hoping I wouldn't see whatever had just taken off return. My dog still looked uneasy. Even after the creature disappeared, he didn't suddenly relax or run outside. Whatever he had sensed had frightened him enough that he wanted nothing to do with the backyard. I trusted his instincts. Animals often notice things long before humans do, and seeing him completely freeze like that made the experience even more unsettling. After calming down slightly, I did the first thing that came to mind. I grabbed my phone and sent a message to my mom. I wanted to tell someone what had just happened, while everything was still fresh in my mind. I explained that I had seen some kind of large, shadowy creature sitting on top of the backyard fence. I admitted that I had absolutely no idea what it was. I described how suddenly it had taken off into the air and how incredibly loud its wings sounded. Even as I typed the message, I realized how unbelievable it sounded. If someone else had told me the same story, I probably would have looked for a normal explanation. Still, I knew what I had experienced. Whether there was a simple answer or not, it had genuinely frightened me. Outside of telling my mom, I kept the experience mostly to myself. I didn't bring it up with many other people. Part of the reason was that I didn't want people thinking I was making things up. Another part was that I honestly couldn't explain it. I didn't know what I'd seen. Without a clear answer, I figured it was easier to simply leave it alone. Life went back to normal. Days passed. Then, about 2 weeks later, something happened that caught my attention. Local news articles and online posts started appearing about sightings of something people were calling La Gurgola. Apparently, several people claimed they had seen a strange winged creature in different parts of the area. Some stories described a massive dark figure flying through the night. Others claimed it had been attacking chickens on farms. There were even reports of horses being found with deep bite marks that witnesses couldn't easily explain. As more people talked about it, the nickname La Gurgola started spreading. Reading those stories immediately brought me back to what I had seen in my own backyard. For the first time, I wondered whether there might be some connection. To be clear, I'm not someone who automatically believes every story about cryptids or mysterious creatures. I generally prefer practical explanations whenever possible. At the same time, I try to keep an open mind. There are plenty of things in this world that people don't fully understand, and I don't think it's impossible for unusual events to happen. I'm not claiming that I definitely saw whatever people were calling La Gurgola. I honestly don't know. Maybe I simply saw an unusually large bird under poor lighting conditions. Maybe the darkness distorted its size and appearance. Maybe fear made the experience seem more dramatic than it really was. Those are all possibilities. But there are two things I can't forget. The first is my dog's reaction. I've never seen him freeze like that before or since. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He didn't even step outside when I opened the door. He simply stood there, completely rigid, staring at whatever was perched on that wall. The second thing I'll never forget is the sound. Even now, years later, I can still remember those wings. It wasn't just the volume. It was the weight behind every flap. The sound felt powerful in a way I've never heard from any ordinary bird. I've spent plenty of time outdoors before and after that night. I've heard all kinds of wildlife. Nothing has ever sounded quite like that. Looking back now, I still don't have an answer. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation that I'll never discover. Or maybe I happened to witness something that other people in the area were also trying to understand. Whatever the truth may be, that night has stayed with me ever since. I can still picture that enormous dark silhouette perched silently on top of the concrete fence, my dog standing frozen beside me, and then, in the blink of an eye, that mysterious shape launching into the night with wing beats so deep and heavy that they echoed through the backyard long after it had disappeared into the darkness. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I only know that it was real enough to stop my dog in his tracks, frighten me into slamming the door shut, and leave me with a memory that I still can't fully explain.